Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right into Chapter 15, Approaches to Working with Young Children with Intellectual Disabilities and Sensory Processing Disorders. Whether you are thinking about a future career in teaching, maybe you babysit on the weekends, or you just want to be a more empathetic person in your community, understanding how to support young kids with unique learning and sensory needs, that is an absolute superpower to have. So let's get into it.
Today, we're going to use a really simple what, why, and how framework to navigate our 5 key areas. We will cover defining intellectual disabilities, causes of intellectual delays, teaching and learning strategies, sensory processing disorders, and finally, supporting sensory needs. Okay, let's hit the road.
Section 1. Defining intellectual disabilities.
Let's start with the what. What exactly is an intellectual disability? Well, spoiler alert, it is absolutely not just about a test score. A diagnosis actually requires 2 things to be true at the exact same time. First, you need to see sub-average intellectual functioning, which we usually measure with a lower IQ score. But second, and this is crucial, you must also see deficits in adaptive behaviors. If a kid just has a low test score but functions perfectly fine in their daily life, they do not have an intellectual disability. Both of these challenges have to actively impact their educational performance for that diagnosis to be made.
Think about how intelligence quotient, or IQ scores, are broken down on a bell curve. 100 is your perfectly average score, right? Most people are sitting somewhere near the middle. But when we look at sub-average functioning, way over on the left side of the curve, those scores are actually categorized into mild, moderate, severe, and profound levels. So a mild intellectual disability falls in the 55 to 70 range, while a profound one drops under 25. Knowing these specific levels is a total game changer for educators because it tells them exactly what kind of tailored, individualized support a student is going to need to actually succeed.
But remember that second requirement, the adaptive behaviors? These are basically the real-world skills we all need to survive and thrive. They fall into 3 main buckets. You've got conceptual skills like reading, writing, and understanding time. Then social skills, following rules, taking turns, making friends. And finally, practical skills, like getting dressed, keeping up with personal hygiene, or making a sandwich. A deficit here just means a child really struggles to meet the typical independence expectations for their age group.
Section 2. Causes of Intellectual Delays.
Moving on to the why. Let's look at the developing brain. If you've ever taken a biology class, you definitely know the whole nature versus nurture debate. Well, an intellectual delay is almost always a super complex, intertwined mix of genetics, our DNA, and the environment. And this is especially true during those crucial early developmental years when a kid's brain is rapidly growing and making connections.
Let's look at some of these environmental impacts. Some happen before a baby is even born, things like exposure to teratogens, which are harmful substances, fetal alcohol syndrome, or maternal infections like rubella. But others happen well after birth. Lead poisoning from old paint in a house, traumatic brain injuries from a bad fall, or even severe emotional neglect and poor nutrition can deeply impact a child's cognitive development. It honestly shows us just how incredibly vulnerable the developing brain is to outside toxins and trauma.
The good news, though, is our science is getting better every single day. Thanks to new technologies like brain scans, researchers and doctors can actually physically observe how these environmental and genetic factors alter neural pathways. And that helps us figure out what environments stimulate healthy brain development and what interventions are actually going to work best when a child needs help bridging those cognitive gaps.
Section 3. Teaching and Learning Strategies.
So how do we fix this? That brings us to the how. A major hurdle for kids with intellectual disabilities is something called generalization. That's basically the ability to take a skill you learned in one place and use it somewhere entirely different. Like if a kid learns to tie their shoes sitting at their desk at school, they might completely forget how to do it when they are sitting in the hallway at home. As teachers, we have to deliberately teach them to generalize by practicing the exact same skill everywhere. Different rooms, different materials, different adults, until it finally sticks and becomes second nature.
To teach a really complex skill, we use a strategy called task analysis. Think about when you first learned to drive a car. It was terrifying and overwhelming until someone broke it down step by step for you, right? For a seatbelt, then mirrors, then ignition. We apply that exact same concept for younger kids by breaking down a huge task like baking cookies. You identify the goal, break it into small visual steps, eliminate distractions, and sequence it out. Suddenly, baking cookies goes from impossible to totally manageable.
We also pair that with 2 really awesome techniques, scaffolding and backward chaining.
Scaffolding is when you provide a heavy support at first and then slowly back off as the child gets the hang of the ropes. Backward chaining is kind of a neat trick where the adult does all the hard steps at the beginning of a task and lets the kid do the very last step. This guarantees they experience immediate success and get a huge confidence boost. Then you just slowly work your way backwards as they master more pieces of the puzzle.
Section 4. Sensory processing disorders.
Let's shift gears back to the what for a completely different but equally important concept from this chapter: sensory processing disorders. Imagine if the quiet hum of your refrigerator sounded like a literal jet engine, or the tag on your t-shirt felt like rough sandpaper rubbing against your skin all day long. That is what it's like when a child has a sensory processing disorder. Their brain struggles to integrate everyday sensory input. And this isn't just about the 5 basic senses. It includes the vestibular sense, which is our balance, and our proprioceptive sense, which is what tells us exactly where our body is in space.
You typically see two extremes here. Hypersensitive kids are overly sensitive to the world. They run away from large, noisy groups. They might hate being touched, or they refuse certain foods because the texture literally overwhelms their nervous system. On the flip side, you have hyposensitive kids. They are undersensitive. Their brain is basically starved for feedback, so they are constantly seeking stimulation. They might need to be bounced all the time, spin in circles until they fall down, or literally crash into furniture just to feel where their body is. Now, when a kid is desperately seeking extrasensory input, like, say, playing with a basket over their head, it is so easy for that behavior to be completely misunderstood. If a teacher doesn't know anything about sensory processing, a hyposensitive kid who can't sit still and touches everything might get unfairly labeled as a bad kid or misdiagnosed with ADHD. Getting the accurate identification right is absolutely essential to getting these kids the help they actually need.
Section 5. Supporting sensory needs.
Which brings us to our final how. How do we support these sensory needs? Well, occupational therapists use something called sensory integration therapy, often in specialized sensory gyms. They use some really incredible tools like suspension balance swings, bins of highly textured sensory balls, weighted vests, or even squeeze machines. These tools basically feed the child's brain the exact sensory diet it's craving. It helps them map out where their body is in space and calms their nervous system right down so they can actually focus on learning.
But hey, you don't need a fancy, expensive gym to make a difference. Teachers can help right in their everyday classrooms. Simple accommodations like dimming those harsh fluorescent lights, offering flexible seating like yoga balls, carefully managing group sizes to avoid overwhelming noise, or just making a quiet, cozy, safe space for a kid to retreat to, that can completely turn a student's entire day around.
To wrap up this explainer on Chapter 15, I want to leave you with a final thought. Knowledge is really only powerful if we use it to build empathy. So, the next time you see a young child acting out, struggling to learn, or maybe covering their ears in a loud room, just pause for a second. Ask yourself, what is their behavior trying to tell me? How could your empathy, your understanding, actually change the trajectory of a misunderstood kid's life? Thank you so much for exploring this vital topic with me today. Keep learning and keep advocating.